Hello and welcome to Mild Speculation Episode 7. In this video series, we are going through everything about N5 until we get N5. When will we get N5? I don't know. I would really like it in the next week and a bit, please, Corvus Belli, because I have an event I need to run in 2 weeks. Please drop the new edition soon. But in the meantime, let's talk about Kestrel Colonial Force. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I did a video which covered all of the non-Kestrel, non-JSA profiles that had been released, and I said in that video that I wasn't covering Kestrel or JSA then for kind of two reasons. The first was it would just be too many profiles to do in one video. That video already ran to about an hour. But secondly, kind of more importantly, for both Kestrel and JSA, we weren't many profiles away from having kind of a complete enough picture to do a video in proper for each of those factions by themselves. Now, I would say at this stage that JSA is still a little bit opaque for me. We've seen a lot of profiles, but it's not yet clicking together in my head exactly how the faction plays. But Kestrel is another matter entirely. I think particularly with the release of Drummers, we've seen that profile this week, we now have enough information that maybe making a few inferences about how certain things we haven't seen the profiles for will work, we can kind of see how Kestrel kind of might play. And so in this video, we're going to be doing sort of a faction-focused style video, but we're not going to be starting with here is how I think Kestrel will play. We'll just be going through profiles, profile by profile, assessing them, seeing how they fit into the faction, and drawing a conclusion as we go, before concluding with a list that I have written for Kestrel Colonial Force using almost entirely profiles that we have the stats for already. And so, without further ado, let's jump into the Kestrel Colonial Force. Now, first up, we have Kestrel's N5 roster, including the availability of all troops in that sectoral. And you'll note I've highlighted a few notable unknowns in red. We actually have a less complete picture than this. The profiles that I've marked in red are ones that I think we do need to see to really have a proper and complete view of the faction. But realistically, there is more that we don't know. We don't know what all of the drone bots look like. I haven't seen the profiles for Fugazis or Pathfinders. We don't know exactly what the tags will look like. We haven't seen the profiles for Squalos or Tickbalangs. We've only seen Maximus. So there are a lot of things that could change around the edges, but I think except for those profiles in red, we can kind of reasonably make assumptions about what everything else will do. We have a broad idea of how the Tickbalang and Squalos will function based on how they function in N4, and the fact that they were excellent in N4, basically. I don't think either of those tags needs significant buffs, because if you significantly buff either the Squalos Mach 2 or the Tickbalang, you just make a broken model, and that doesn't seem to be the design philosophy mostly for most of the things that we have seen for N5. Similarly, stuff like Fugazis and Pathfinders and Sierras and Clippers, etc., are also kind of fundamental to just how your basic support function elements work in Infinity. I don't expect Fugazi drone bots to change. I don't expect trauma docs, or machinists to hugely change, for example. They might, and so those are, to an extent, still unknowns, but I think we can at least go through the profiles that we have and kind of draw some conclusions. Now, I've put a red box around Dart because I think she is kind of ripe for rework. I like Dart, but she is an expensive piece, and if you compare her to some equivalently costed elements in N5, you think, yep, she's going to get touched up in some capacity. By Pandra and Richard Quinn, I'm less sure about. I think both of them will absolutely see changes, because every character that we've seen has seen some changes that are generally positive and increase the utility of that profile. So by Pandra especially, Quinn especially. But what those will be, I've kind of got no idea. I expect both of those profiles to still fit in kind of the broad same role, and I don't expect either of them to get more expensive, probably. But I also don't expect either of them to have the same kind of impact as learning what the profiles for BCA Magistrates or Mines Corp Jackals or Father Knights, or to an extent Dart, will be on Kestrel Colonial Force. So those ones in red, but especially the Jackals, the Magistrates, and I think to an extent the Father Knights and Dart, are the profiles that could still materially change how Kestrel plays. So those are significant unknowns. Everything else is either known, or we can draw some reasonable conclusions about. Now, in terms of fire teams, we can see that Kestrel has one Fireteam Core, one Fireteam Haris, and an unlimited number of Fireteam Duos. And following in from the N4 model, they have their Line Infantry Fennec Fusiliers Fireteam, which can be a Core or a Haris team, but not a duo. And that's actually relatively significant in N5, because duos in N5 are very, very solid. If I could run a duo of like a Fennec ARO piece and a Fennec utility piece, I would do that. Like, I would put multiple of those on the table. I can't, fair enough, I can't spam those duos, so we find our duos in Kestrel elsewhere. So, in terms of fire teams, we have our Fennec fire teams, Core and Haris, which can be joined by Fennec Fusiliers, Griffins. So Griffins count as Fennecs. Griffin are the HI. Now, this counts as is significantly less important in N5. As a reminder, the overwhelmingly most important level of fire team is to get to level 2, which is 2 of the same troop type in the fire team. That's what gets you the +1 burst, discard the worst. Otherwise, at level 3, you're getting a bonus to discover and dodge rolls. That's nice, but not essential. At level 4, you're getting +1 to your ballistic skill. That's nice, but not essential. And at level 5, you're getting Sixth Sense. That's nice, but not essential. And so because that level 2 is the most important, the fact that a Griffin counts as a Fennec is like, yeah, fine. Like, you're likely to get to ballistic skill BS +1 slightly easier. You can do that with 3 Fusiliers and a Griffin, but it's not super important, right? Otherwise, in this fire team, we have the Black Air, which is going to be probably a very important profile, at least in terms of how people think about the faction initially, and then Magistrates. We do not at this stage know what Magistrates do, and so they're one of the unknowns. Next, as a Haris and Duo option, we have Kestrel fire teams. Now, these are significant. Yep, you can include Griffins. Fine, I expect Griffins to most of the time appear if they appear in Fennec fire teams. More importantly, Kestrel fire teams are our source of Fireflies and Hetkari, and both of those are potentially quite important pieces to be able to employ effectively in a list. Now, just as a note, in the fire team list for Kestrel fire teams in particular, it says Fireflies count as Kestrel troopers, but nothing else in the Kestrel team does. That's because if we look to the wildcards, we can see that Bipandra and Richard Quinn both count as Kestrels. So if you have, for example, a fire team of a Hetkari, a Firefly, and Bipandra, that counts as having 2 Kestrel models, and so would give that +1 burst bonus. We then have armored fire teams in duo. You can have Tikbalangs and Squalors. Both of those can include up to 2 of those in an armored fire team. We can have Maximus, Fireflies, and Bulletiers. Now, these are going to be fire teams where it will be very difficult but not impossible to get that duo bonus. 2 Tikbalangs gets you the duo bonus, 2 Squalors gets you the duo bonus. And those are expensive investments, although it's probably able to do that affordably, at least based on the N4 Squalo profile. And so I do absolutely expect to see lists that attempt in some capacity to make use of the burst bonus on tags, and frankly that does sound kind of horrifying on Pan-Oceanian tags. If you can make the rest of the list work around it, and I think particularly with Fennec Fusiliers the way they are, you probably can. But otherwise, these duos are a way of stapling either a Firefly engineer or a bulletier of some description to another tag just to make that tag do useful things. Now, you have to have at least a Tikbalang or a Squallow. You can't, for example, put a Firefly with Maximus. You need Tikbalangs or Squallows in this fire team. That's fine. Those are excellent tags. Maximus is quite good, and we will be looking at him. But I expect Tikbalangs and Squallows to remain kind of the staple, probably, of how Kestrel tag play works. We then have the Mindscorp Haris and Duo, or Colcorp Haris and Duo, consisting of a Magistrates and Jackals. These can be either a Haris or a Duo, and we have no idea how these will work. To get to a Haris team, you will need at least 1 of each, because you can only put 2 of each in a link, or you can put in wildcards, so you could do something like, for example, 2 Jackals and a Crux team. I don't know what any of those profiles do at this stage, so that's one of our significant unknowns, particularly if the Jackals function as assault pieces. One of the things we are not missing, but not having in great abundance in the profiles that we will be able to look at over the course of today, is close assault, is like really just get up the guts and beat your opponent to death at short range. And it seems pretty likely, given what we know about how Mindscorp prior to Colcorp works, it seems pretty likely that the miniatures that Jackals and Magistrates will probably have will be some kind of like digger-style close assault unit, but we don't know at this stage. Then in terms of wildcards, we've got Father Knight Crux FTOs. These will probably be Armored and Dangerous Knights, but again, we haven't seen them yet. Pathfinder Dronbots can just join teams in Kestrel Colonial Force, although of course you can only have one of them in any team. They will not contribute to link bonuses because there's no way for them to do so, but Pathfinders are probably useful. We've then got Bipandra, Dr. Priya Harper, and Richard Quinn. And we'll be looking at Priya Harper today. We don't know the profiles yet for Bipandral or Richard, and all three of those potentially have some play. Bipandra and Richard counting as Kestrel in particular is useful. Counting as a Fennec is whatever. I don't particularly care about that. Fennec profiles are good. We can just put those in link teams. I'll put 2 Fennecs in a link team and be happy. But fitting 2 Kestrel models into a Kestrel fire team so you get that +1 burst, particularly when we come to look at the Hetkari, we would like the Hetkari to benefit from that, because why not have the best gunfighter in the game, probably? And so being able to have a Firefly and Bipandra or Richard, or even Bipandra and Richard linked with the Hektari, offers some intriguing gunfighting possibilities. Overall, these look like solid setups. You can easily do a large core, a medium core. There are very attractive Haris options. The duos are a little bit more difficult to, like in terms of utility duos, a little bit more difficult to unpick at this stage, just because we have the least information there. But this is overall a pretty promising and versatile setup, and you will see the list that I've run at the end, or have built at the end of this video, makes use of both a core and a Haris team. And so, first cab off the rank, we have Fennec Fusiliers. Now, I'm going to be going through these in approximately the way that they are laid out in the Fire Teams chart. So I have grouped them by linkability, and that means we have Fennecs and units that can join Fennecs up first. A Fennec, availability 5 in Kestrel Colonial Force, is just a Fusilier that trades 1 point of armor for 3 points of BTS and picks up Terrain Desert for free. Now, that by itself is nothing exceptional, but Ballistic Skill 12 on a line troop is totally serviceable and nice. Where we get very, very interesting with the Fennec Fusiliers is once we get past the kind of generic gun options, because there is an awful lot of extremely high utility there. So just in terms of generic stuff that we would always expect, there's a Fennec Combi Rifle, there's a Fennec Combi Rifle Lieutenant, there's a Fennec HMG, there's a Fennec Missile Launcher. These are all totally fine. I probably don't expect to use like the HMG or missile launcher in great numbers, just because I think there are probably better ways in particular to use SWC in Kestrel Colonial Force, although there's at least one interesting way to get more SWC, which we'll cover when we get to Dr. Raya. But all of the rest of the Fennec profiles are really solid and interesting. And there's stuff in here that is just like high utility and high explorability, for want of a better word. So just to start with, we have a submachine gun light rocket launcher profile for 12 points. That's the kind of thing that you can use as back pocket active and reactive workhorse duty, and it's 12 points and costs no SWC. We've got a Thunderbolt +1 burst profile that has triangulated fire, not sure about that, but it has mine layer and shock mines for 14 points. This is the kind of model that I would put in duos if I had the option to do so, right? That Thunderbolt +1 burst going into a duo is firing 4 dice on 12s at good solid range and is a mine layer with shock mines. That's a steal for 14 points and no SWC. And I think it will be excellent as a back pocket gun if you wanted to just slot one into a small team, maybe to provide an active turn weapon to a Fennec team that is housing a black air. We've then got a comlink. We'll see what reinforcements do. Can't really comment on that at this stage, but it isn't too expensive. The hacker, also an excellent profile, kind of calling back to the Aconto hacker that this is displacing. Yes, it's a hacker with hacking device. It's nice and cheap at half an SWC and 16 points because it's got a submachine gun and emitter, and importantly, it's got a fast panda. Fast pandas are super useful, particularly when we're trying to do generally well-rounded hacking stuff and we don't otherwise have any network projection. The forward observer has a disco baller, and it's only 12 points. Disco ballers are a way to generate eclipse zones, which otherwise you just would not see, like visibility control in Panoceania, and it's on a 12-point profile that uses its ballistic skill to place this thing out to good solid range bands. And then the paramedic is a paramedic. There is a lot of really interesting stuff in here. The Thunderbolt is excellent, the Disco Ball is potentially useful, the Hacker is a good hacker, the right rocket launcher is a 0SWC gunfight ARO piece. This is a great stable of options that gives you really nice and interesting choices as just absolute backbone quality stuff. I think the first Kestrel Colonial Force is starting off in an excellent place with these guys, and these are up there probably with Ghulam Infantry, maybe even surpassing Ghulam Infantry in terms of interesting chewy options to add into a list. And that's fantastic because they're also the starting point for our most common core, which we can then make more interesting by adding other, more specialized pieces too. On which note, let's talk about the Black Air. Now, the Black Air is kind of a horrifying selection of profiles. There is a lot that's going on here. Now, the basic setup for the Black Air: Ballistic Skill 13, Mimetism 3, Multispectral Visor Level 2, Combat Instinct. Combat Instinct, as a reminder, is the skill that makes you immune to surprise attack. So you can get to Sixth Sense, which is the skill that lets you shoot back through smoke. Combat Instinct is the skill that gets you immune to surprise, and we have it on, for example, a high quality ARO piece. Armor 2 and BTS 3 is fine, otherwise this thing is just a good solid gunfighter, admittedly for expensive costs. Now, there are a few profiles I don't expect to see a great deal. The FTO hacker with hacking device for 26 points and a submachine gun, I don't expect to see that a great deal. Yes, it's WIP 13 and BTS 3. By Pan-Oceanian standards, that isn't a bad hacker at all. But 26 points it's just a lot. Now, we might see the half an SWC 31-point forward observer because a K1 marksman rifle on that quality of gunfighter is kind of interesting, but it's still a single wound shooter, and K1 is fundamentally a meta pick. If you need K1, then having it on a marksman rifle that is going to be regularly firing 4 dice on 13s with Mimetism and an MSV2, that's really solid. If you think you need K1 marksman rounds, marksman is a good platform for K1. Like, that's a good weapon if you need weapons like bullets that reduce enemy armor to 0. If you're fighting against things that don't care about it or are immune to it, or it's just not the target environment for that piece. So I expect to see the Forward Observer Black Air as at most a tech pick, but I expect to see the remaining 2 Black Air profiles a lot. And we're going to start with the Neurokinetics Fireteam option. This is just Neurokinetics and a multi-sniper, which means that if you pop this thing into a Fireteam with just 2 Fennec Fusiliers, you are firing 3 dice, drop the worst in ARO, Ballistic Skill 13, Mimetism, and a Multispectral Visor level 2. Now, that's just really good. That's like high watermark ARO level stuff, and you can, if you need to, push this thing up to Ballistic Skill 14 if you really surround it with Fusiliers. I probably wouldn't, because I don't like over-investing in large fire teams. I think it locks too much stuff up in singular positions and static elements, but even just 2 Fennecs and this guy goes a really, really long potential way. Now, you do have to be aware of his weaknesses. Firstly, multispectral visors are not without downside in N5. Models have albedo. We will see some albedo profiles as we push on through this video, and albedo imposes a penalty on models with multispectral visors and marksmanship. So you can potentially have gunfights where your black airs are mechanically being countered. And obviously being neurokinetics means that if you want to fire with this thing inactive, assuming that neurokinetics is unchanged, and it probably is unchanged, you're only going to be firing 2 dice, drop the best. Now, that's still manageable. That's not the worst face-to-face roll in the game, but you are specializing in ARO. Still, at 33 points, this is a single wound piece, it can go down to bad luck, but in terms of just models that are good at winning gunfights in ARO, there's not much we've seen that's better than a linked Black Air at this stage, and so it represents, at present, a high watermark profile in the edition. The other piece that I think we will see is the Black Air Killer Hacker Parachutist Deployment Zone. Now, we have, since the release of this profile, seen at least one scarier Deployment Zone Parachutist. But for 31 points, that's not bad as far as the cost of Deployment Zone Parachutist goes, and it's a specialist, which is relative, not necessarily the most useful thing on a deployment zone model, but isn't bad to have, and it's still got all of those apex gunfighting pieces, and on a submachine gun, that's not the end of the world. Now, submachine guns are just shock weapons in N5, they've lost their armor piercing, so you aren't just going to be like shooting tags in the back and lighting them up cheaply and easily, but just having a deployment zone parachutist in a faction means that your opponents need to be aware of that as a threat. And if you run a 14 trooper list with just one hidden thing, Kestrel Colonial Force, we will see as we go through this video, presents an awful lot of threat that can come from that one hidden thing. Is it a Black Air? Is it a Scarecrow? Is it a Blink Team? Is it a Banshee? I'm scared of all of those, and I need to figure out what it is. And the fact that the Black Air is a 0 SWC threat at about 31 points means that whether it's in your list or not, if it looks like it's in your list, your opponent needs to adjust their deployment accordingly. So overall, I think the Black Air is a profile that will probably wane in significance a little bit over time over the course of the edition as we kind of get used to it, right? Like when when Varuna dropped in N3 and the Kamau sniper was at the height of its power, everyone lost their freaking minds for like 6 months, and then we all more or less got over it, and then the edition changed. I think we will see kind of the same thing with the Black Air, because frankly, 33 points for a single wound trooper that can just go down to a bad face-to-face roll is a lot. It locks up a lot of SWC, locks up more than 10% of your total points, but it's still really good. And there are certain matchups that you could just run into where it just dunks on your opponent real hard. So very solid profiles, and along with Fennec, an excellent start to the faction. Next up, we have Griffin Troops, which can join Fennec fire teams and count as Fennecs. And they're fine. These are just solid heavy infantry. They're better than Orcs, except that we haven't seen N5 Orcs yet. Overall, though, 6-2 move is nice, Ballistic Skill 14 is nice, Armor 4 BTS 6 is nice, 2 wounds is nice, and they have Multispectral Visors level 1, which is really quite nice. Although, again, Multispectral Visors aren't without downside in this edition, and they have Jump 8 inches, which is really just a fluff skill, but that's fine. So when you jump, which Griffin Troops can only do as a long skill, they don't have super jump. Normally you go a flat 6 inches. Troops jump 6 inches, which is a surprisingly long way if you look at the scale of a model, but troops jump 6 inches in N5. Orc troops jump 8. That's fine, that's nice, not bad to have. Otherwise, the weapons are totally serviceable as well. We've got a multi-rifle option, a HMG option, a Feuerback option, and then a HMG Lieutenant. Not a specialist to be seen, but we wouldn't really be wanting models like this to pull specialist duties anyway, and with the MSV1, you have a variety of options in terms of profiles that you engage, the ability to see through smoke, etc. Now, these guys don't excite me, but that doesn't mean that they are by any stretch of the imagination bad. You can get them up to a comfortable 5 dice, drop the worst on 14s or 15s pretty easily, and that's just good solid gunfighting, particularly with an MSV1. There are plenty of lists that will make good use of these guys, and the models are nice. Now, I think there are flashier ways to spend both your points and SWC in Kestrel Colonial Force, and those are the things that I will probably be spending my points on, but when we compare Griffins, for example, to Drummers, it is fairly easy to make the argument that the Griffin is just a more robust, more self-sufficient not self-sufficient, but more robust and less requiring of like external support from things like Evo hackers or engineers. It just does what you need it to and has a reasonable chance of being recovered by a doctor or a paramedic if it goes down, and it's less likely to go down. Overall, these guys are totally fine, and the fact that they are veteran troops does give them actually like a reasonably solid niche in missions like countermeasures, if we see those in the next ITS season, which we probably will, because they have multispectral visors and are heavy infantry and are veteran troops, which lets just a Griffin do a relatively wide variety of classifieds by itself as part of a link team that can cover other bases. So I like these guys. I'm not going to be leaping to put them into lists, but they are just excellent meat and potatoes options. Whether you need the HMG or the Feuerback, those are all attractively costed. They cost basically the same. Make the meta pick on what you need. It's going to be the HMG and the Feuerback profiles that are probably the most common. I don't really expect to see the multi-rifle Pulsar option as a door kicker, but if it turns out that like every other close assault piece sucks in this faction, which I would consider to be highly unlikely, you could see the multi-rifle Pulsar as just the tip of the spear in maybe kind of like a Fennec link. I don't expect that though. It'll be the SWC choices that are most common, and the SWC choices are totally fine. So moving on from the Kestrel fire team, which I think is quite well appointed to be just generally your fire team core, it will serve quite well in that capacity, we get into models that go into our Kestrel fire teams, which can be a Haris or a duo. And we are starting with Firefly's Clandestine Demo Squad. Now, you can also put Griffin troops in one of these fire teams, but you're not going to, and we'll get to why. Now, Fireflies are one of now a couple of medium infantry profiles that we've seen that are packing Albedo -6. The profile otherwise, Ballistic Skill 13, nice. Whip 13, ooh, that's nice. Armor 2 BTS 6, that's nice. They have Albedo -6. Albedo in N5 is mimetism against multispectral visors. Now, we haven't seen the rule, we've just been told what it does, so we don't know for sure, for example, that Albedo doesn't still have the stupid thing it has in N4 where it runs out after a turn of each player, runs out by the end of round 1. But my assumption is that it wouldn't. My assumption is that Albedo just works as mimetism, but against models with multispectral visor and marksmanship. Ballistic skill attack survivability rating -1 is just the old ballistic skill attack +1 damage, so slightly heavier weapons. Shock immunity, not a bad thing to have on a single vitality model. Stealth, that's nice. NCO is excellent, and terrain total is good. Now, before we get to the profiles and the points costs, Albedo -6 and NCO both give Fireflies just by default a niche. They're also veteran medium infantry, so we can do those classifieds again. But having the ability to take just a lieutenant that's just a Fennec and just stick them someplace, great. And Albedo as a tech choice is something I think will probably be quite relevant. I expect to see plenty of things like black airs in the meta, and having a model that is actually very well appointed to engage something like a black air, that's going to be relevant and useful. And so just keep your eye out for Albedo Neg 6 models, because even if the profiles broadly look a bit mid, a bit too expensive, whatever, having that skill is something that you just want in your back pocket. So there is a Yuching medium infantry that has come out that I think is in that like, these are mostly okay, but I will still take them sometimes because Albedo is good to have. Now, diving into the profiles themselves, there is some interesting stuff here. I'm just going to pick out the things I think that are most interesting. The hacker, I don't think is interesting. The deployable repeater is 19 points. I don't think necessarily that interesting, but there's some stuff here that's cool. Firstly, we have a heavy rocket launcher assault pistol profile. It is the only gun, only significant gun that's like that, combis and submachine guns. If you want a model that makes use of the fact that they have Albedo, you got to fork out 1.5 SWC and otherwise a very reasonable 24 points. Now, this model will almost always be linked, which means that's a 3 dice heavy rocket launcher drop the lowest. 3 dice on, say, against a black air, 3 dice on 10s. The black air is firing back with 3 dice on probably 7s. That is not the best face-to-face roll in the world, but it is still a positive face-to-face roll for you, which quite a lot of things won't necessarily have against a black air. So having that option existing, also working against models with marksmanship, I assume that the fluff there is that true marksmanship, like good enough to qualify you for the skill, doesn't happen without some kind of visual sensors, so Albedo again messes with that. This is a profile, this is the tech pick profile. Like, if you think you need this to deal with stuff that has multispectral visors on ARO, you take it. Now, the next most interesting is the submachine gun chain of, well, another interesting one is the submachine gun chain of command profile, just because it has chain of command. We can see chain of command seems to have gone down in points a little bit. Good. It was probably a little overcosted in N5. 23 points for a chain of command profile is, again, that's fine. I am not going to be taking this particularly much, but it's the kind of thing that just having access to it as an option when you need it is good to have. The hacker, I think, is serviceable. It is BTS 6 and Whip 13. BTS 6 in particular, that's a nice to have on a hacker. You might see something like this just as a way to round out your hacking presence in missions or with setups that require it. It's certainly a better hacker than the Fennec. It's also much more expensive. It doesn't have a fast panda. Where we get into the really interesting meat is, firstly, there's an engineer profile in here. It's Whip 13 engineer, and there is a lot of stuff that you can engineer back in this faction. We have all of our remote presence tags, we have all of our usual remotes, we have drummer bots, which don't have remote presence, but being able to recover them is still good, and then we have the red eye. Now, just to note, you cannot repair a red eye except with a gizmo kit while it's in flight. But probably when it goes unconscious, the airborne skill, assuming that the airborne skill is automatic, will turn off. And at that point, you can engineer it and it'll fly again. And so having that ability to recover, but even just having the gizmo kit, the red eye is reasonably receptive to being gizmo kitted. I wouldn't gizmo kit a red eye unless it was unconscious, but having that option there is good. And this is a model that you can staple with NCO to just all of those tags. You can staple it to a tick belang or a squalos, and now you've got NCO and an engineer specialist for 23 points. That's very solid. It's also got a gizmo kit, which they are trying to make worthwhile in this edition. 23 points is a steal if you're running tags. Finally, okay, there's a medic in there as well. Cool. The medic is notable because it has a combi rifle, and the combi rifle just maybe plays into being able to make use of that albedo. So I would not sit like, don't sleep on the combi rifle paramedic, but it will be a sometimes pick. Finally, we get to the piece that I am most excited for. Not necessarily the best piece, just the piece that I am most excited for, which is the mine layer, submachine gun, Panzerfaust decharges, AP mines, and an armed turret with a marksman rifle. Now, the position of the armed turret in this profile doesn't confirm, but it kind of suggests that it might be a deployable piece. It occupies that kind of interesting space where you can see how like Gizmo Kit is next to AP mines, but it's differentiated in the same way. Armed turret works that way as well. We do not know how these work. The fact that the Firefly has mine layer, whereas other models that we've seen with armed turrets don't have mine layer, does not automatically mean that the armed turret isn't deployed for free at the beginning of the game. I kind of hope that it is, that it's deployed for free at the beginning of the game, and that you can't reload it. If it functions as a regular deployable, mine layer lets the Firefly deploy it during the deployment phase, which is by far the best time to be able to put down an armed turret with a marksman rifle. What is the armed turret going to be like? I don't know. But based on ITS season 15, 14, etc., where we saw those things experimented with, it probably looks quite a lot like that. Now, if there's a rule where armed turrets can just be placed for free at the beginning of the game, Mine Layer is still excellent because we've got AP mines on the Firefly. So if we can, and I would like us to be able to deploy those armed turrets for free at game beginning, then the fact that this is a mine layer means you can still place those AP mines. So in either case, I have wanted deployable turrets in Infinity for like half a decade, which is how long I've been playing Infinity for, maybe longer at this point. This profile is incredibly cool and exciting, and at 21 points, it's affordable. Is it going to be good? I have no idea. I don't know the rules for armed turrets. I don't know what their ballistic skill and durability is going to be. I don't know the rules around placing them. Too many unknowns still at this stage, but I'm excited regardless. This is the most exciting profile in Fireflies for me, although there is plenty of utility for the rest. Now, they are still paying medium infantry costs. And so you have to treat these things as medium infantry pieces. You would not run 3 of these in a Harris team most of the time. You'd run 2 and maybe an actual better gun or a different support piece or whatever, but 2 or 3 of these in a list still offers some really high potential value just for the NCO alone, plus all of that utility. Very excited for the marksman rifle, excited for the engineer duo with a tag. There's a lot of potential use for these guys. Now, last up, excluding wildcards in the Kestrel fire team, we have we have the best gunfighter in the game, I think, probably, with the Hetkari Shooters. These are I mean, look, they are expensive. These things are insane. 6-2 movement, that's great. Ballistic skill 14, oh, that's really good. Can it be better? Yes, we'll get to that. Whip 12, that's fine. Armor 5, BTS 6, so it's on the heavier side for a heavy infantry. It doesn't have no wounding capacity or anything like that, but Armor 5, BTS 6, and 2 wounds is really solid, just solid durability. And it has marksmanship and ballistic skill attack -3, and good guns. Christ. Now, this is a piece that is less powerful than it would be if it just dropped naked into N4, right? Because marksmanship has counters. Albedo counters marksmanship. Ballistic skill -3 has counters. Warhorse counters ballistic skill attack -3. There are circumstances where a Hetkari shooter can be brought back down to earth a little bit. But in its ideal environment, it's just hitting on 17s with 5 dice and -3 to your opponent back and armor-piercing rounds. Like, this thing just goes incredibly hard, and the weapon loadouts are serviceable. Like, it's got good guns. Now, most of the time, like, it's going to sit into its role as an apex piece with the multi-Red Fury. Now, we should acknowledge the Red Fury's limitations. 24-inch range, yep, fair cop. Right? It's not necessarily a rampart sweeper from anywhere on the table. It needs to move into position, which means it may need support fire or have to gap close by itself. I can see situations where the Hetkari is not able to really flex because of slight constraints on range from the multi-Red Fury. But the multi-Red Fury will have AP rounds and shock rounds and is firing an absolute ton of dice. And it's only going to be survivability rating 7, which is not the strongest in the game, right? Effectively power 13. It's just a Red Fury, but it's an armor-piercing Red Fury. Now, the missile launcher is kind of a more niche profile. It's interesting. It's the same points cost, and you'll probably just take the multi-red fury like 100% of the time, but someone will experiment with a linked Hetkari shooter as an ARO piece. And yeah, that sounds kind of horrifying. Probably not 48 points horrifying, because it is something that you can just smoke past. But if you wanted to build an absolute, like, ridiculous meme ARO list, you could do that. You could build the Hellscape in Kestrel Colonial Force. The multi-red fury is where it's at for practical use, but don't totally discount the missile launcher. And because of those mods, because of marksmanship, because of BizTac -3, if you link this thing, that missile launcher might actually just be able to win some face-to-face rolls, because 2 dice on 17s while your opponent has a -3 is enough to actually kind of punch through quite a lot of pieces that might be used as casual ARO elements. This guy he's the best gunfighter in the game right now. He, again, not as good as he would be if it was just an N4 profile, but it's not an N4 profile. We evaluate it in the context of N5. It's still really, really good and terrifying. Excellent profile. Not necessarily an auto pick, because we haven't seen what the tags look like, for example, and the tag duos are interesting. And he kind of warrants being put in a Haris team with a couple of models that can prop him up. And you do start getting expensive at that point. But on the other hand, you could also very easily just take one of these guys as your lieutenant and just run him around by himself and kill everything, because multi-red furies will do that with those many mods. So very promising, very powerful, one of the high watermark pieces. Do make sure you evaluate it as an N5 profile, not an N4 profile, but very, very good. Now, last up in terms of Fireteam models, we have Dr. Priya Harper. Archeo Raider, and I'd like to thank Corvus Belli for making that model not look how I imagined it was going to look based on Lara Croft associations. It's actually a really cool looking piece. She is super interesting. Now, she counts as a Kestrel model when you prop her into a Kestrel fire team, and there is a ton going on in that profile, and it will be very easy to conclude that she's not fantastic. And she's probably kind of balanced, but she also sits in this niche as one of the first support element gunfighter things in the game. Let's just sort of unpack what we have going on here. So the base profile is very average. Ballistic skill 12, willpower 13, is specialist in Panoceania, so willpower 13 is not the worst thing in the world. Armor 1, BTS 3, 1 vitality. That's a very average profile. That's like barely more than a Fusilier. But nanoscreen, nanoscreens are quite good in N5, and X-Visor. I mean, X-Visor, that's fine. Okay, what are we applying with that? Well, from there we've got Dodge +3 and Booty. Booty, I don't know what the table will look like in N5, but that's a nice to have. Shock immunity and no wound incapacitation. Okay, here we go. No cover, that just pairs with the nanoscreen. Now, one thing that I don't know about at this stage is whether or not marksmanship will ignore nanoscreens. If marksmanship doesn't ignore nanoscreens, that's interesting. Then, Specialist Operative Tactical Awareness. Okay, so she's a linkable tactical awareness profile with just a grab bag of useful stuff. That's cool. What else do we have going on? Well, when we get to the weapon loadouts, particularly the FTO, I think is probably the most relevant choice. Yes, you can have a forward deployment 8-inch model, but she doesn't get anything other than forward deployment, and she pays a bunch of points for that. So I think it's usually going to be the FTO. She has a plasma carbine. She's only ballistic skill 12, right? Even with a link bonus, she's only going to be firing 3 dice, drop the lowest, or worst, rather. But plasma is plasma. And a nanopulsar, and a +1 burst viral pistol, which will be 4 dice, that's pretty respectable, and EM mines. Now, because she isn't hackable, and she has a nanoscreen, that combination of EM mines and viral gives her kind of a role as a close assault piece, particularly with her durability if you need it. She has the capacity to potentially sweep and clear a room. She doesn't necessarily want to, but it's something that she can do. Okay, there's a lot going on there. What about her SWC and cost? Well, the bad news is that she costs 32 points. 32 points is a lot, especially for a model that you are mostly kind of taking, not realistically for gunfighting, but for a little bit of close assault and tac aware and specialist. Probably the most interesting thing about her profile for me overall, both thematically and in terms of the utility it offers, apart from tactical awareness and stuff, which is good, is the SWC +1. This is a rule that is normally only associated with lieutenants. Like, very, very occasionally you can take a 6 SWC list to 7 SWC by taking some kind of a lieutenant choice that often made it difficult to take full use of that in any case. Like, Joan with +1 SWC in N4, you just couldn't fit all of the SWC in that list anyway most of the time if you were building the list otherwise correctly. And so this on a model that is completely untethered from your lieutenant, doesn't telegraph your lieutenant, brings utility by itself, is really interesting. Now, 32 points is still more than 10% of your entire army. That's a lot. She doesn't necessarily justify all of that otherwise, but it's a very explorable option, which is kind of apropos given what she is. I also think it's really cool the fact that, like, thematically, she goes out into these ruins on this new planet and she brings stuff back, and so you have more guns as a result to put into your list. Like, that's just really cool. I just really like that as a thematic element, right? The fact that she has these resources that she brings with her is just a really cool little, like, diegetic kind of nod where the rules are showing off something that is like representative of the fluff. It's very immersive, it's very interesting. And so I think Dr. Priya Harper falls into that category of deeply explorable profiles. 32 points probably locks her out of a lot of lists, but if you can find a list that makes use of that SWC and slots her in as a Kestrel profile, then there is something there. And that, there is something there, is one of the most interesting things in terms of exploring a faction. Maybe you're past your first few games, you've run a list that you're like, yeah, this list is good and solid. How can I make this different and interesting? And so she's a great profile for your like fifth or sixth game with the faction. Once you've got the basics down of how you like, if you like the way that this faction plays, and you've got some good solid fundamentals, you've got some modules that you can swap in or swap out, finding the points for her at that point, I think, is the perfect time to begin exploring her and seeing if she works in the list that you're running. I think there's a lot of potential here. There's a bit of awkwardness, but very, very promising. Now, out of the fire teams and into independent elements, for want of a better word, here are the profiles that I was waiting for before I did this video, and that is the Drummers Mobile Support section. Now, I have people, when we saw this art, right, like this, the art for Drummers was the "we're so back" moment of the emotional roller coaster graph that multiple Pan-Oceanian players went through. People at the time, like I have 2 or 3 people I am sure I saw say, "Oh, that won't actually be a HRMC. That'll be a Thunderbolt or something." Nope, that's a HRMC on an Oxbot, bitches. That is awesome. Is it good? So, what have we actually got going on here? Drummers are effectively, what if you took Auxilla, you took those Oxbot, you made the Oxbots fat and gave them actual guns, and then gave the Drummers guns as well. The Drummers themselves are very marginally upgunned profiles: Ballistic Skill 13, Whip 12, Armor 1, BTS 3, 1 wound, 360 visors, we'll talk about that in a bit, marksman rifles on basically every profile, and pistols, and then just a selection of drum bots, which is where the action is. Now, the drum bots are larger Oxbots. They're Silhouette 3 rather than Silhouette 1, and they are packing heat. So, 6-4 movement on the drum bots, Ballistic Skill 13, Armor 1, BTS 3, 360 visors, courage, mimetism, and peripheral synchronized. Now, a couple of things to note there: not remote presence. Just like peripherals in N4, one wound drops these guys unconscious, another wound kills them, and you cannot re-roll engineer rolls against them, assuming that engineer remains unchanged. The drum bots are also expensive because they have big guns on them. We have multi-HMGs, HRMCs, Fwebacks +1 burst, Mark 12 +1 burst, heavy upgun to light rocket launchers, and just a heavy flamethrower forward observer profile. Now, there's a bunch to unpack here and sort of think about how these things play. But firstly, I want to just talk about the 360 visors, because this used to be a very expensive piece of equipment. We have seen from the released Magari Bagard profile that it has come down perhaps proportionally, perhaps actually in cost. It does not look like you are paying through the nose for a 360 visor as much anymore. And there are just a bunch more really dangerous deployment zone parachutists in the game. We saw one of them in the Black Air, and that's not even the most of it. There are things like Agent Ducash out there in the meta now, who are that's just terrifying. That is scary. And having just a casual ability to be like, oh yeah, no, I'm also watching behind me just in case this bastard turns up, that is potentially a very nice quality of life element. But What these guys are really all about is the fact that you have the drummer being relatively safe as kind of a backup firepower piece, and then the Oxbot as the drumbot as a really, really big gun. And so the drumbots, that's what this game is all about with them. You're not often going to be trying to fork arrows with them. There are not many face-to-face rolls where you'll pull the drummer out and the drumbot out and be like, ha ha ha, which will you shoot? Because they will shoot the drummer. Because if they kill the drumbot turns off. And the points cost here are expensive. 1 SWC and 39 points gets you a drummer and a drumbot with a multi-HMG. 37 points and 1 SWC gets you the Burst 3 Feuerback. 1.5 SWC and 41 points gets you the HRMC. Now, is that a good HRMC? It's fragile, it's 1 wound, armor 1 with mimetism, ballistic skill 13. But you can give it marksmanship with an Evo hacker, assuming that those stay unchanged. And if it goes down, you could feasibly engineer it back, but if nothing else, you still have the drummer, you still have the model generating an order, and there's a lot of value there. So, are these fire support pieces good? I'm actually not 100% sure, but I am optimistic about them and I think they're incredibly cool. I would also note that the fact that the Feuerback and the multi-HMGs are anti-tag level firepower that clocks in at only a single SWC is potentially really nice. That's just a little differentiation. You want the HRMC, you pay the full SWC cost for it. But if you're willing to just fork up 1 SWC, you can get guns that are a genuine threat to enemy tags, enemy armor, enemy anything. And because they can be given support wear, they're still very dangerous. I also want to call out, probably not a sleeper profile because most people will realize this is good. The 20-point drummer profile is potentially really, really good. Now, what do you get for your profile? Well, there, the drummer itself is a forward observer. Cool. What's the drum bot? It's a forward observer as well, with a heavy flamethrower and a flash pulse. Now, what does that mean? Firstly, it means that that drum bot is just cheaper, right? That whole profile is half the cost of all of the rest of them. And if need be, you can just use that drum bot as an ARO piece. Unlike a regular Oxbot, it has more armor, it has mimetism, it has a 360 visor, and it has both a heavy flamethrower and a flash pulse. That's a great ARO piece. If you just need a crumple zone, you can put these into a list. Now, 20 points for the full package is too expensive to spam, and these things are availability for, unless you're dedicating your list toward it. Spoiler alert. But it starts to be the point at which the drumbot itself is cheap enough that you can kind of combo it with, you can actually aggressively move it and the drummer forward and do things that are, you can take those forked arrows, probably not against an enemy tag, although the fact that they're both forward observers, if you have a missile bot in your list, hey, you can fork forward observer rolls with this. That's interesting. And then finally, they are both forward observers. The Oxbot is also a forward observer, and so based on the peripheral rules as they currently work, in which I have no reason to suspect that they will change, even though forward observer is not a skill that gives you a bonus in basically any scenarios other than like player-made ones, you can walk these two things up to a button and get 2 dice rolls to activate that button. Now, yes, one is whip 12, one is whip 11, but 2 die rolls per order in any scenario in the game is really good. Both of them attempting to activate the same console, the same objective, has an 82% success chance. That is better than a willpower 15 model. It's better than a willpower 16 model if that model doesn't have any. Like if you can have an anathematic hacker attempting to open a console that has a Medicaid button, a Medicaid bonus, right, paramedic or doctor bonus, and the drummer and its drumbot have a higher chance of success than the anathematic. That's really good, and it's 20 points, and it comes with other utility. Defensive utility, bit of gunfighting, some forking AROs, forward observers if you want to kind of push that, and it's a little bit sketchy. That's awesome. So these guys are, I think if they were any cheaper, they'd be broken. Well, like every profile that you have access to here, if it was cheaper, it would be broken. As it is, they are expensive enough to not be something that you automatically spam, but they are conceptually incredibly cool, and in practice, I think they're really interesting. You can get high model count armies with them because they're availability 4 in Kestrel. You can do things like go into suppressive fire with both models. If you've got any of the suppressive fire capable like model, there's just a ton here that is really interesting and exciting. I have a lot of time for these, and I am seriously trying to figure out what I already have that I could use to proxy them, and I think the answer is probably nothing at this stage. I'm gonna need to come up with something because, or buy them when they're released. When are these being released? Corvus Belli. Give me the drummers because I will buy these models and a few other Pan-Oceanian models. I would like to get a little bit of Pano back into my collection, and it starts with these guys because they're awesome. Next up, in terms of independent units and continuing the complete bollocks, we have the Blink team. What's the Blink team doing? Well, it's Ballistic Skill 13, Armor 1, BTS 3, those are good. Surprise Attack -3, much harder to avoid Surprise Attack in N5. Camouflage, nice. Hidden Deployment, nice. Mimetism -6. This is just a better version of a Hexer, isn't it? Yes, it is, and it has access to both a multi-sniper rifle and a heavy rocket launcher profile. Does not have a missile launcher, but that HRL at PS5, which I believe is going to effectively make it a +1 damage HRL, plus assault pistols as a sidearm, which means that you can go and do dangerous things at short range if you need to, makes this a very scary profile. Now, compared to a Noctifer, for example, it has a point of extra ballistic skill, is the same cost relative to an N4 Noctifer, but lacks Dogged, and Dogged is a pretty big deal. But these are good profiles. The fact that you've got a multi-sniper and an assault pistol gives you, for 32 points and 1.5 SWC, a very relevant independent asset. The fact that you've got a Wild Parrot and an X-Visor on the heavy rocket launcher version, again, very interesting. I don't know if I would see the Shock Marksman rifle terribly often, but even that's not necessarily particularly bad. I think you mostly expect to use these things as ARO pieces that then transition to an active turn roll. And that's something that the Noctifer doesn't have, that hexes always traditionally have, but then hexes were never quite good enough to really take, just occasionally. The Blink team slots into that role, where it's like, yeah, this is an ARO piece that will mess up your plans if you do not respect it, and then it will also do things in active turn if it needs to. Both the multi-sniper and the heavy rocket launcher, yes, they're not especially high burst, but when you are stacking all of those negative modifiers and have Ballistic Skill 13, you can absolutely connect with these pieces. And the assault pistol just opens the rest of the game plan up for them, where they can fight at almost any range. Now, the SWC cost is probably going to be the biggest issue for these guys. Firstly, because it can just be difficult to find that SWC unless you're taking Dr. Harper. But secondly, because that SWC is what will telegraph their presence. There are lots of other pieces that are going to be very, very scary, that are sort of like hidden or parachutes deployment zone or combat jump that we have access to in Kestrel, but they will usually not cost any SWC. If there is a big and notable hole in your SWC, your opponent goes, all right, that's a 6 SWC list and I can see 4.5. They are going to spend the rest of the game respecting the Blink team, and reasonably so, because you would have spent that SWC otherwise. Yes, you could do fake out stuff where you're like, oh, I'm gonna leave 1.5 SWC unaccounted for so that I can take a black air deployment zone parachutes, but my opponent will think it's a Blink team. Yes, you could do that, but this is still Pan-Oceania. Yes, we've got a little bit of visibility control in the form of the disco balls on Fennecs, but you're not playing a Hack Islam, a combined army asymmetric kind of game, right? This is still Pan-Oceania. You're going to try and shoot things to death. You have big guns. You should be using them, which means that most of them, if you're taking a Blink team, it will be kind of at least a little bit obvious. You can get real big 5-head if you want to. You can big brain this, but I think most of the time, in a list that is really trying to make use of the faction's overall strengths, the Blink team will be slightly telegraphed. Does that make it bad? No, it's terrifying. This is an excellent profile. But you probably need to be aware that it won't surprise people quite as often as you think it will. That the dream of the heavy rocket launcher cleaning up an entire link, probably not going to happen terribly often. Very good though, can play into an overall ARO game alongside. You can do the trick where you put down a black air in the space that you have just immediately previously deployed a Blink team. And when your opponent rolls up to engage that, you just that's a point where you're like, haha, you're stuffed, Sonny Jim. But that's also 3 SWC spent exclusively on, or nearly exclusively on, ARO pieces in a singular defensive position. So there is definite potential here. It's going to occupy a space kind of like the Noctifer, where it is an important piece to take occasionally to remind your opponents that it exists and just to live in their head a little bit, but it's not necessarily going to be dominant. It's just very useful. It's something to slot into lists occasionally. And the fact that it actually can take both an active turn and a close assault, the fact that it can always be an order dump if you need it to, that is what really sets it apart from things like the Noctifer. Now, the Noctifer can do that, right? The Noctifer has an assault pistol. It's one of the nicest things about the Noctifer. But the missile launcher as an active turn piece is burst 1, and there are limits to burst 1. This is Ballistic Skill 13, and it's burst 2 on the most common profiles. I like it. Not going to put it in every list by any stretch of the imagination. Simply can't afford it. But I do like it a lot. Next up, independent pieces, Banshees. And combat jump really seems to have gotten cheaper, which I'm fine with. I'm totally here for. What do we get for a Banshee? Well, it's a medium infantry. It's spec trained, which means it can't do veteran classifieds, but medium infantry can do certain things. It's 4/4 movement, but that's kind of bollocks, which we'll get to why in a second. Ballistic skill 12, Fizz 12, willpower 13, armor 2, BTS 3. So it's kind of heavily armored. Fizz 12, so combat jump gives it both. It's got both parachutist and combat jump. It has super jump with jet propulsion and an MSV1. MSV1's quite nice. Now, that super jump is why we say the 4/4 movement is actually slightly misleading, because when a model declares jump, it goes 6 inches. That includes super jump as the first short skill. So it is probably more accurate to think of the Banshee most of the time as 6/4 or like 6/2. If you can move 6 inches and shoot, particularly if you're shooting something in the back. And I believe, comments, feel free to jump in and correct me if I'm wrong here, that a model that super jumps and then super jumps again goes 6 inches and then goes 6 inches again, which means that just in terms of maneuvering around, this thing is fast. That's relevant for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's just fast, that's good, but it means it can maneuver inside the deployment zone if you're attacking there, etc. It also means that if it fails the Fizz 12 roll to land, it can get back into the fight surprisingly quickly. It also means that if you choose to use parachutists, like the problem with parachutists for all of Infinity up until now is that the board edge is a long way away from the action a lot of the time. Not always, right? There will always be circumstances in any individual case, any series of games, you'll have that game where you're like, oh, I can just walk on here and immediately begin to start shooting things. But a lot of the time, stuff like mission objectives and where the action is aren't guaranteed to be adjacent to the table edge. But when you can move 12 inches in a single order, you can get from the table edge to where the action is much more quickly. And so that super jump jet propulsion, plus the fact that it's a ballistic skill 12, MSV1, decently started, whip 13, armor 2, BTS 3, that's good. Now, in terms of weapon loadouts, I would say broadly, kind of uninspiring, but there's a light shotgun. Light shotguns, as a reminder, are worse in N5, except Pulsar +1 burst. Thank you very much. Decharges for doing classified objective sabotage, I guess. We then have a submachine gun with Pulsar +1 burst and a wild parrot. Wild parrots are very good. It's 3 more points than the light shotgun. Submachine guns and light shotguns are very close to equivalent. I believe the light shotgun does have a template. That's kind of nice. I think it has that template mode. So, I would probably marginally favor the light shotgun, but meh. But wild parrots are definitely worth some points if you can spare them. And then we have 2 hacking profiles, all still just with a submachine gun, Pulsar +1 burst, hacking profile, or killer hacking device profile. Now, in addition to just the maneuverability, where the Banshee gets really, really interesting is in those points cost, because if you just blank those points cost out and asked an N3 or an N4 player to tell you how much this model cost, they would be pushing, like they'd be saying 30-something points. The cheapest profile is 19, and 19 is splashable. You can just find 19 points in the list if you need to. You can cut like one thing and be like, oh yeah, I'll just put a Banshee light shotgun in there. But that might do something. And at 19 points, you can just roll the combat jump and be like, oh, it didn't work. Oh, that's fine. She'll get back in the game at some point. Because a model at 19 or 22 points, but 19 points especially, like sub 20 points, a model just doesn't have to succeed hugely to justify itself. You can roll the dice on a 19-point model. That's part of what made, for example, the Greif operator the preferred infiltrator for impersonator for some players who played Spiral Core, etc. Ed, because if it failed, you weren't losing 40 points of investment on Janstar and friends. You were losing half of that. And so you could be more aggressive, you could roll the dice with it more, you could take more risks, because the cost of those risks materializing was half the price. And the same thing applies here with the Banshee. So all of the other profiles, as much as wild parrots are very good, I think my starting point for this is actually, I'm just going to try and squeeze the 19-point model into lists, just to see, just to be like, give it a chance, because if the 19-point profile performs, I can then start upgunning it. I can be like, oh, let's get a wild parrot in here. Oh, let's make it a killer hacker. It's whip 13, that's not too bad. But it is the points cost and the fact that super jump, jet propulsion, and the way jump rules work in N5 de-risks the failure of failing to land the combat jump, and de-risks using parachutist, that makes the Banshee promising. So, interesting profile. Not going to be in the list that I put in at the end of the video, but could very easily be if you wanted to just cut, say, a 20-point model and slot in that 19-point Banshee. It would be very easy to experiment that way. Next up, we have the Scarecrow's Active Recon Group, who have just some of the edgiest edgelord descriptions in the game in terms of their fluff, but we aren't talking about their fluff here. What have we got here? We've got a Crocman kind of profile. We've seen many of these before, we'll see many after. This is a pretty good one though. So, notable things that set it apart. Ballistic skill 13, good. It's actually got a little bit of armor and BTS, 1 and 3. Surprise attack, hidden deployment, camouflage, infiltration, mimetism 6, stealth, terrain total. So this is, apart from the fact that it's able to get up to ballistic skill 13, just what we expect from this kind of profile. Not really a lot of bloat there, not like X-Visors on everything, for example. Now, our weapon loadouts are a mix of boarding shotguns and submachine gun nanopulsers. Just to talk about that a little bit, neither of those are hugely appealing, and there's no longer range option, but both of them did get kind of a little better, specifically in the respect that templates in the enemy deployment zones will probably be slightly rarer than they were in N4, or at least a little harder to find. Remember that in N4, every shotgun was a template. That's no longer the case, which means that a model like the Scarecrow has a higher chance of being able to move toward the opponent's deployment zones and actually gunfight and make face-to-face rolls, and not just get zotted by a template weapon that ignores his mimetism the first time he encounters a trooper with a shotgun. Now, the profiles here otherwise are just kind of fine. A deployable repeater is interesting and could play into certain game plans, boarding shotgun. The hacker is fine and could play into certain game plans, but it's a little pricey, same for the killer hacker. The mine layer with AP mines is, remember that there are very few other camouflage models in the midfield, but there aren't none. We have access to Dart, and technically also the Yamabushi, although the Yamabushi does not deploy very far forward, so you would need to pull that AP mine a long way back to have it pretend to be a Yamabushi. But if there is a Kestrel midfield game that relies on a shell game, it will probably potentially involve maybe a singular Scarecrow mine layer just to, say, confuse where Dart is for your opponent. Then there's a forward observer. Cool, there's a forward observer. Now, I think it would be very easy to assess the Scarecrows relative to things like N3 Crocmen, and that would be a mistake. Crocmen and hidden deployment generally is very expensive in N4 and prior editions, because yeah, it is a good ability, but it's very worth kind of recognizing that hidden deployment is not an ability without downside. The fact that hidden deployment models don't generate their own order until they appear, and they use that order to appear, means that if it's not the time or place for a model like a Scarecrow or a Blink team to appear, you are down orders in some of the most important turns of the game. Now, that isn't a colossal disadvantage because you will get that order the turn that they appear, but it is a disadvantage, and it does tend to maybe pull some people, particularly like myself, who are absolute order whores, away from hidden deployment and drop troop profiles, and it looks like those rules have been downcosted afford accordingly in N5. So, if we compare a Scarecrow to a Crocman, yeah, it looks way better than the Crocman. It's got more ballistic skill and it's cheaper. There's just better. Yes, it's better than an N4 profile, but we aren't going to be playing N4. How does the Scarecrow stack up as an N5 profile? Well, I'm a little wary about the more expensive profiles here in particular. These things are not cheap on their own merits. 29 points, 26 points, 27 points. There's some really good stuff that those will get you in this faction. I can get a Blink team. I can get a Banshee. I can get a much cheaper drummer forward observer. I can get Fireflies to start linking with a Hetkari, etc. There is a lot of good stuff in this points bracket and above and below in Kestrel that just finding the points cost for a Scarecrow is going to be a little bit tricky. Now, one of the things we don't know is what the silenced pistol does. There was some very early testing done by people based on, I know at least one person who played a game, assuming that the silenced pistol based on the quick start rules just applied an unmodifiable -6 to your opponent because it said silence pistol -6 in the quick start rules, which is almost certainly not what it does. That was, and they reported back that, oh yeah, the Scarecrow is really good because it -15s everyone all of the time. I'm like, yeah, that does sound like it would be really good, and also not how these will work. Without knowing what the silence pistol does, my assumption is that it will not be it'll be a rule that is interesting and useful and prevents warning or alert or something like that. It might do more than that. It might be really good, or speculative. It doesn't break camouflage. You can something like, okay, whatever. We don't know what the silence pistol will do. I am assuming that it is not transformative, and assuming that it's not transformative, Scarecrows are fine. there is always going to be a meta take on whether or not you want these, and that's mostly going to be, hey, what's the scenario mix like? Hey, am I incentivized to run a midfield? Has Dart dropped and she's really good, and I want to be able to sort of just confuse which piece might be Dart? Those are the kind of things that would let you take a Scarecrow, just leaning a little bit into some midfield as part of a broader tactic. I think I think if we divorce them from how much better they are than a Crocman, on their own merits in N5, they're promising, but they're just promising, and that's fine. And it's nice to have some promising skirmish elements in Kestrel, but they're not where I'm going to be leaning towards at the very beginning of exploration into the faction, because as much as, for example, fewer light shotguns and shotguns in the meta as template weapons means that they will be easier for them to attack, I think people will go out of their way to find those template weapons, and we've certainly seen like nanopulses and pulsars for days on stuff like the Kestrel profiles. So there are still templates in the game, they'll still be vulnerable to those. They are BTS 3, and there's a lot of things like nanopulses and pulsars, but I think they're promising, and they will round out Kestrel nicely, but they're not where I'm going to be starting my exploration. Up next, just a few to go now, we have the Red-Eye Close Air Support Squad. Now, we talked about the Red-Eye and Flyers in the previous video, covering in episode 6 of My Old Speculation. By all means, just jump back to that if you want my full thoughts on it. In the context of Kestrel specifically, it's worth noting that the Red-Eye is the only Silhouette 7 model that you have access to, which is actually really in its favor in this particular context, because it means that just protecting it on your first reactive turn, right? The big disadvantage of Silhouette 7 is that the bastards can just be really hard to hide on certain tables. And the Red-Eye, as an aerial model that can't take cover, does not, even with Mimetism 6, does not want to be caught out and getting shot on your first reactive turn. It wants to be able to be a predator piece, make use of its mobility, push forward, pull back, etc. You play it almost like a tag. Because it's the only Silhouette 7 model in the entire faction, you have the luxury of often putting it as your reserve piece in a position where it isn't in danger on your first turn. Whereas if you're running, say you're playing Videla Panoceania and you're running the Red-Eye and a Cutter, well, okay, to be fair, the Cutter is admittedly a piece that can hit and deploy or deploy into camouflage, but you are congesting the amount of places that you can put Silhouette 7 models by having more than one of them. I wouldn't, for example, run 2 Red-Eyes particularly often. But in Kestrel, just one. It's the only Silhouette 7 model in the entire list. That is a nice point in the Red-Eye's favor in specifically the context of Kestrel. Is it good in Kestrel overall? Well, it's costing almost exactly the same amount of points as a Hetkari, and a Hetkari is really, really good, but they occupy very different niches. The Hetkari is an apex gunfighter, but even with 6-2 move, it is only so mobile. The Red-Eye absolutely motors. It's a flyer, it can get around, etc. We've talked about how flyers work. I think it's a cool part of the force mix. I think you will want to build defenses that can stop flyers, whether they are hacking defenses. Often they will be hacking defenses, or even just hard AROs that can challenge them. So just something to keep in mind as a meta perspective. But as far as flyers go, I think Red-Eye in Kestrel is one of the good ones. Second to last, and the only tag that we can cover and we have seen in this video, Maximus, Optimate, and Hexadome Legend. Now this guy is full-on tag prices for not quite full-on tag capability, but, so what have we got here? CC24, that is a really good number. Now, he's got Natural Born Warrior, but no martial arts, but he does have CC attack -6, which means that he can just about hang in close combat, particularly given he's got a very dangerous APDA CCW. Ballistic Skill 14, Armor 6, BTS 6. Now, hang on, isn't that a downgrade to his armor? Yes, but he has Immunity Arm, which means that he's immune to armor-piercing rounds, which means AP6, Armor 6 actually has a really good chance of going a long way. 4 structure, 4, that's because he has an escape system. Now, escape system is just a kind of transmutation in N5. Once he takes 3 wounds, that's what escape system -3 means, he transmutes into Operator Maximus. That is, in many respects, kind of a downgrade. Now, the actual way that escape systems will function is better. They will drop Eclipse Grenade, so the model that is under the escape system actually has a really good chance of surviving if it gets put to that point. And Maximus, even outside of his full-on tag armor, is still a model that you don't want to run into in close combat most of the time. But it means that Max can't leave the tag, which means that he can't do specialist mission roles until he has taken 3 wounds. This is the same problem that the Gorgos had in prior editions and still has in N5. Maximus now has that problem as well. That's not the end of the world, because we have some fairly, I mean, we just talked about how drummers are excellent specialists and how you can do things like bolt and engineer to Maximus. No, you can't do that because he isn't a Firefly. He isn't a legal start to the armored duo. Never mind that. So you need to be able to find a way to get specialists still functioning in your list if you take Max, because he can't leave the armor anymore. But with that said, otherwise, this is an interesting profile. He has exchanged his old marksman rifle for a Thunderbolt +2 burst. Isn't that just a HMG? Yes, that's just a HMG. That's a HMG that doesn't cost any SWC, Corvus Belly. You could have just made that a 0.5. Okay, what it isn't, it can't go into suppressive fire. That is the difference, significant difference between a Thunderbolt +2 burst and a HMG, and not being able to go into suppressive fire does matter. He's also packing an EN carbine and a heavy pistol, which means that he technically has ranged weapons that can fight all the way from 32 out to 0, which is kind of cool. And just kind of interestingly, he just dodges 4 inches on 13s now. So he doesn't have that dodge equals X that we would usually see on tags, which means he's just, kind of good at dodging. Although, Fizz 13 is not that high for a tag, but we can see that his DA, AP, CCW is probability of survival 4. Now, personally, I find Max overall kind of hard to assess because he's a model that doesn't cost almost any SWC. 0 if you take his lieutenant profile, half if you take his non-lieutenant profile. But 76 points is still very expensive. That's full-on tag prices. And he does not have armor-piercing rounds. It's just a regular Thunderbolt. You're getting survivability. He's actually surprisingly durable. You are getting that close combat ability. He retains a lot of his strength even when he transmutes, which means he really is effectively kind of a 4-wound model. It is going to be quite difficult to put him all the way to unconscious through those 4 wounds. Silhouette 6 is the best silhouette for a tag. It's very mobile, but it's still small enough to hide. Like, it's good, but 76 points is expensive. And when we look at what tags will be able to do in Kestrel, you have duo options with quite attractive duoable pieces on our other 2 tags. Now, until we see the Tikbalang and the Squalos, we can't make any assumptions about who outperforms who. But it is unlikely that either of those pieces will become weaker in N5, and I don't know how they compare to Maximus right now. I think with Chain of Command and him as the lieutenant, there is some interesting play there, but at 76 points, he begins to edge out all of the pieces we wanted to spend the SWC on. And so the question kind of remains, what is the list that we fit him into that makes the fact that he costs little to no SWC work? Is it a guided missile list? Like, it actually might be. It might be a hacking Kestrel list that spends all of its SWC on stuff that enables the hacking game and kind of equivalent elements, and so then needs Max and other Thunderbolt pieces as gunfighters. That's very speculative. And so, while I think he is interesting and has potential, I don't yet know how he fits into almost any of the factions that he can play in, and he can play in quite a lot. Last up, we have the Beast Hunter at home, the Yamabushi. Now, this is the profile that with the most unknowns of all of the ones we've spoken about, because we don't have a clear picture yet of exactly what Frenzy does in the next edition. We expect it to work approximately the same, but we know that there are going to be some changes, like it gives limited cover now, I think is something that I heard. The profile otherwise, what do we get? 6-2 move, that's quite nice. CC23 and Martial Arts level 3. So compared to the Beast Hunter, which he is replacing, he can actually fight really well in close combat. Martial Arts level 3 is a significant breakpoint, because it's the level at which you get that extra dice. And once you start adding an extra dice into everything else that a model in close combat like this can do, you go a really, really long way. Ballistic skill 11 is mid. You don't really want to be using it with any of his weapons, but he does have a Panzerfaust on some of his profiles. Okay, that's fine. Forward deployment +4 is fair enough. +8 would have been excellent. +4 means that you have to do a little bit of work to get him into close combat, and close combat is really where he wants to go. He's good at dodging, which means that you could feasibly advance him on the field by move dodging. That'll get him 10 inches rather than 8. Mimetism 3, excellent. Stealth, excellent. Dogged, excellent. And Religious Troop. Now, Dogged is a big deal here. He does lack shock immunity, but he has a weapon set that is likely to be able to significantly capitalize on just one extra turn, one gap close through a chain rifle into close combat, etc. Points cost are looking at 15 to 16 points. There are FTO options, although I don't believe he can join any fire teams in Kestrel. And so instead, we are overwhelmingly likely to be taking the Camouflage single use. Now, there is a Medikit profile on the 16-point FTO. I don't think we're going to be seeing that. That's something that might have some relevance in maybe JSA. I think there's probably a lot more scope for use of that in JSA, presumably where he can link. In Kestrel, I think we're going to be taking most of the time one of those two camouflage one use options, because it is a forward deploying 4 mimetism 3 camouflage marker, which if we're doing, shell games with Dart and a Scarecrow, forward deployment 4 is what's going to keep him limited in that role, because it will be kind of obvious. It's like, oh, that one's not as far forward, that's the Yamabushi. But it's still scary under that camouflage, and that camouflage gives him that just one extra layer of insulation, which if you spend the orders to get him forward, camouflage and dogged collectively gives him usually enough layers that your opponent has to peel to actually make contact in close combat. That's really cool. If you don't end up using that, I should note that despite being a warband, he is a regular trooper, which means that if he does nothing but sit under that camouflage for the entire game, 16 points is expensive for a regular order, but it's not untenable. So one of those two profiles, the Panzerfaust gives you some ARO potential. The tactical bow is obviously going to be less dangerous, but the tactical bow profile has shock mines. Pick your poison. I think both of those is entirely viable. In either case, they are mostly going to be about the chain rifle and then the heavy pistol, double action, shock, close combat, power and strength 4. If you have to gunfight with this guy, or at least fork an ARO, you can combine the chain rifle and the heavy pistol. It's ballistic skill 11, but a heavy pistol is a heavy pistol, but ideally what you're going to be looking to do is use that 6-2 movement to get into close combat with CC23, martial arts level 3, and contact with that power, with that probability of survival DA weapon. Now, these guys are only availability 1 in Kestrel, so you can't spam them. You can't, for example, take 2 like you could in JSA, but I think one of them is a very fine pick in basically any list that you might be inclined to take it in. If it does nothing, it was only 16 points, and the high watermark for what it can accomplish is very high. Now, I don't have one in the list that I've written at the end of this video, coming up very soon, but I think it would absolutely have been a good inclusion. It's just that I was trying to push certain other things, and so it got displaced. But it's a very, very, very solid piece. 16 points, quite an easy take, although for just a few points more, for example, you could get a Banshee. Still, as part of an overall defensive mix, as a little bit of bubble wrap, I just don't think you're ever going to go wrong including these things in your lists. And 16 points just for the potential that it might have, even if it only lives up to that potential 1 game in 3, is still worth those points. Now, wrapping everything up, here's a list that I've written using almost entirely models that are available and we have seen the spoilers for. Now, there are, I think, 3 models, three profiles in this list that we haven't seen the rules for. One of them is Fusilier Indigo by Pandra. She just fit in kind of nicely, but you could potentially replace her with a Firefly, for example, and move some points around. So what have we got? We have 3 Fennec Fusiliers. 1 combi rifle, 1 combi rifle lieutenant, so the classic combi rifle and decoy, then a Fennec hacker submachine gun fast panda. I wanted to, just in terms of a rounded defensive mix, I don't want to play early N5 without at least 1 hacker and at least 1 repeater. Like, I have already seen threads on Discord where people have just lost their absolute marbles about the Seraph of all things. If you lose the game to a Seraph alpha striking you in your deployment zone, then you have no one but yourself to blame in terms of how you've done your list construction. Just put a little bit of hacking in to give a piece like that pause. Just do it. Yes, the Seraph is very fast. You have means of stopping stuff like that, and that starts by, if you can, just popping some hacking into your list. Just enough to give pause to that kind of piece, and at the cost of an SMG Fast Panda, Fennec Hacker is well worthwhile. Those 3 models will then link with a Black Air Neurokinetic Sniper. Now, I mentioned that I think this is a piece that will probably fade out a little bit over time, but early in the edition, I want real good ARO stuff, and it's real good ARO stuff. We've then got a 3-person team. So we've got the Hetkari multi-red fury. It's too good not to take, at least in the initial rollout of the faction. I want to play it, I want to experience it, I want to see if that 24-inch range mate is actually a problem, or if it does kill as many things as I think that it's going to. It is Haris teamed with a Firefly SMG mine layer turret. Now, there's a very good argument that I shouldn't be taking the mine layer turret in this case, and I should be taking something like an engineer instead. There's no engineer in this list, and we have quite a lot of remotes, and if the Hetkari gets bricked by enemy hacking, you would really like to be able to unbrick it, because it can't unbrick itself. So this Firefly should probably just find a couple of points somewhere and make it into an engineer. I'm not doing that because I want the turret. I have been wanting a turret in Infinity for as long as I have been playing, and I'm going to play with the turret. Once I have gotten over that, then we can do something like maybe just massage a couple of points here and there in order to get that engineer in. We have, now this is one of the first unknowns, I am just assuming N4 stats, which is almost certainly wrong. Fusilier Indigo by Prandra. She counts as a Kestrel model along with the Firefly, which means that she gives the Hetkari +1 burst. Cool, great. Apex Predator, this is a good little link team, and if the Hetkari goes down, I can recover it with Bipandra. We then have the first of 4 drummers. 2 forward observers, 2 multi-HMGs. Now, there are 2 reasons why I've gone with this many drummers. The first is, I love them and you can't stop me. But more practically, we have spent a lot of SWC on the Black Air Neurokinetic Sniper, which is potentially going to struggle to try and be an active turn piece, and the Hetkari Multi-Red Fury, which I don't think will struggle to be an active turn piece, but might find itself outranged in some cases. I want more big guns, and those multi-HMGs cost 1 SWC. And, very neatly, with 2 multi-HMGs, still paying for the SWC cost of the Fennec with Fast Panda, we have just enough SWC to get a Mulebot Evo Hacker into the list, which means that those 2 different drummer bots we can give marksmanship, assuming that Evos work the same way. We then have a single Fugazi drone bot, which I am also assuming is not going to change and still be 7 points. Now, that puts this list very neatly at 300 points and 6 SWC, assuming Bipandra, Mulebots, and Fugazi don't change points costs, and I think Bipandra especially is probably likely to, so yes, you will need to revisit this list if you were going to try and play it exactly when N5 arrives. Some other things that are worth noting. I think if I had some spare points, I would probably consider actually making the Hetkari into the Lieutenant, just so that I can use the troop slot to turn one of the other Fennecs into a Thunderbolt Mine Layer profile, because I think that profile is super cool and interesting. And I would really actually like to have just that as an active turn and defensive piece in that link team, but I did not have the points cost. Second thing to note is that this is only a 14 trooper list. If we could find 3 points, we could splash in a War Correspondent, which I think probably is relatively sensible, but there are enough things that are scary or noteworthy that could occupy that 15th slot that I don't feel too bad about running a 14 trooper list with Kestrel. Even if my opponent is like, it's pretty close to 300 points, but then like you've already spent all of your SWC, but they're like, might be a Banshee just waiting in the wings, I'm fine with putting that kind of evil on them. Again, if I had 3 points spare nice and neatly, I would probably consider putting a War Correspondent in, and so hypothetically, if Bipandra comes down by exactly 3 points when we move into N5, and I otherwise can play this list as is, I would probably pop a War Correspondent in there. Finally, as noted, the list is kind of dying for that Firefly turret model to be an engineer. You can actually fit that in if nothing else changes. Turn one of the drummer multi-HMGs into a Feuerback. That saves exactly 2 points, which is enough to upgrade the Firefly SMG Mine Layer into a Firefly engineer. But as noted, I have wanted to have deployable turrets in this game for as long as I've been playing this game, so I'm just going to, at least to start with. Now, in total, this gives us a list that has got hackable but scary close assault. So those drummers, forward observers, those things are going to be moving forward. They're going to be taking fights up close if I need them to, pushing into objectives, accomplishing missions. It's got great long-range firepower with the multi-HMGs and the Hetkari, including a ton of armor-piercing rounds. It's got pretty excellent defense. It's got the black air and it's got some hacking, and if I need to, it's got drummers, potentially drummer bots as ARO pieces, particularly the flamethrower ones, and it has the deployable turret. If the deployable turret doesn't need mine layer to place, then I also have an AP mine from the Firefly. And finally, it's got a doctor and good specialists. This list should be able to accomplish basically every mission. It can do, I think, it can possibly do every classified or very close to every classified, since it's got visors and veteran troops and engineers and hackers and doctors and forward observers. And so overall, yes, it is taking maximum availability of drummers because I like peripherals and I think they're cool and that idea is awesome. But more generally, I think this is the kind of list that you could potentially run into N4 with and experience good results with. It would need to be tinkered with because at least some of the points cost, like any of the points cost on anything could change, because they did say that stuff was still subject to change prior to final release, and there are models in there that we haven't actually seen, including Fusilier by Pandra. But with those caveats, this as a basic model feels like it could be a really cool way to start N5. Now, just to close the video out, okay, we've gone through a lot of profiles there, and I have had very little bad to say about any of them. Does that mean I think Kestrel will be overpowered? Probably not, but I do think it will be very good. I mentioned at the beginning of the video that JSA remains a little bit opaque to me, and that is because JSA, as much as it seems like martial arts costs have come down a little bit, and martial arts is better. Like, JSA, if any of those models in JSA get into close combat with you, they will mess you up. JSA looks like it is still that faction that is in that tension where it has good enough gunfighting and good enough resiliency and good enough durability and etc., but there's still a lot of martial arts all over the place. The payoff for those martial arts is higher. The ability, the things that counter those martial arts are lower, since Natural Born Warrior doesn't just completely no-sell it anymore. And so the JSA fantasy is really live, but you still have to really work for that fantasy in JSA. Kestrel, by comparison, is the Pan-Oceanian fantasy. It is going to shoot you. And it's got some really, really good profiles for that. Like, everything here has had care and attention paid to it. Even the Hetkari, I am not convinced is overpowered, because at the end of the day, probability of survival 7 is not a particularly low number. But it's just quality in that Pan-Oceanian kind of way, where they just do the things that you do most of the time in Infinity. They shoot. There's just a lot of stuff where it's like, this list on screen now probably doesn't want to push into a hacking network, because I didn't really have the models to compensate for that. Yes, I should probably have some Yamabushis in here, but then I wouldn't have all of the drummers shut up and leave me alone. But with that as kind of a notable restriction, this is just really solid stuff. It's just good defense and good offense and good shooting, and a lot of how you play Infinity is using those kind of pieces. And so Kestrel, I think, is a faction with a significant amount of depth. It's got a little bit of shell game, good hidden stuff. It's got at least one good troop in almost every archetype. It's got a little bit of close assault. It's got great gunfighting, but more importantly, it's got multiple great different types of gunfighting. And the link team loadouts are really sound. It's just kind of the platonic ideal of a Pan-Oceanian sectoral. The only thing that it's missing is a Silhouette 7 tag. And at least based on everything else that we've seen, we've got absolutely no reason to assume that the Silhouette 6 tags won't absolutely slap. And if I'm given the choice, I would rather take Silhouette 6 tags than Silhouette 7 tags. So I think it's going to be it's just going to be a very strong faction straight out the gate. I don't know if there's any one piece in it yet that they will inspire the level of fear that something like, say, Agent Ducash will. I don't know if there's anything in Kestrel that people will have to really learn and iterate and figure out how to defend against, because it's kind of obvious what you do in each of these cases. How do you deal with the Hetkari? Don't engage it in a face-to-face roll, and don't let it engage you in a face-to-face roll. How do you deal with the black air? Well, you either eclipse past it or you engage it with a model with albedo. How do you deal with the drummers? Well, they're just single wound. You can deal with them the way you would deal with single wound troops. You can brute force them. You can hide from them. You can kill the drummers. Like, nothing here feels unsolvable. And as much as there have been some absolute microwave brain takes about things like whether or not the Seraph is overpowered, there is stuff that we have seen come into the game that is actually going to be like, oh, I need to think about that. Like, how am I going to solve for Agent Ducash? Because he is a 2-wound deployment zone parachutist model that can absolutely prey on things that are not aware. In this list, I've done it by having 8 models with 360 visors. That feels like it might do the trick. But not every faction has access to that, so how will other factions do it? I think though, in terms of starting Infinity, Kestrel and Vanilla Pan-Oceania probably put you in a really good spot in terms of just like, I want to be able to play with most of the things the game lets me play with, and I want to be good at them. Kestrel is excellent for that. I began playing Infinity with Neo Terra and Shock Army Viconta Cemento, and Kestrel feels like it sits bang in the middle of those two. And so overall, although I don't know if I would call it one of the big winners of N5, because there isn't enough information to talk about that, to make that kind of conclusion yet, if you are a player who is getting into Pan-Oceania or getting into Infinity with Kestrel Colonial Force, I think you're in a really, really good spot. Now, that wraps up this video. As a reminder, if you like the things that I'm doing and would like to support the channel, you can do so via either the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below, or by becoming a channel member. Big thanks to everyone who has so far. Now, we are probably very close to N5 at this point. We don't have a clear release date. I've seen some people speculate that it could be as early as the 9th, so we might see the new edition this week, we might see it next. I would really like for it not to take longer than that, because at that point it will literally be Christmas, and also I have an event that I'm hoping to run that will be an N5 event. And if we don't get N5 in the next 2 weeks, I can't run that event, which would really suck. But I do realistically think that our chances of getting the edition before then are pretty good. We will have to wait and see. Very much hoping for it. I think CB is aware that they can't wait terribly much longer, and obviously when N5 drops, it will drop with content. We'll be doing things like hot takes. I'll probably have Jordan in on the panel, and we will do an absolutely unhinged, just completely uninformed hot take all factions tier list. I expect that to be both popular and like completely wrong in many respects. We will do faction focuses. We'll probably do some battle reports. We'll bust those out again. And I'm overall very much looking forward to it, assuming that we can get it before Christmas. So we will see. As always, otherwise, I hope very much that you enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time.